Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn from the Nightlife Programming team.
And I'm Christina, the event producer.
Thanks for tuning in. Hard to believe, but it's actually December, and we are down to our last two night schools for the year, tonight's program and next week's virtual version of our annual holiday bazaar. But don't worry, we'll be back in the new year with night school every week for all of January. But back to tonight's program, we are talking about our wildcat neighbors.
I also wanted to shout out to our resident DJ Nightlife who picked that song for our waiting room. So if anyone noticed that track, yay. Anyway, tonight we'll learn about mountain lions, or cougars or pumas, on the West Coast, including populations on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, down to the Santa Cruz Mountains, and some fascinating research projects being done in those areas to help understand and conserve wildcat populations. So first up, we have Cameron Macias, graduate research assistant at the University of Idaho, and she'll talk about the Olympic Cougar Project, the first predator study in the Lower Elwha Klallam Tribe's historic use area, and a large-scale collaboration between Panthera researchers and Washington tribes. And then we have Chris Wilmers, who's a professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at UC Santa Cruz, and he'll talk about his work studying the local Santa Cruz Puma population in an area increasingly affected by humans.
As always, tonight's program is live, so say hi, let us know where you're watching from, if it's your first time joining us or you're a repeat visitor, and share any comments or questions you have in the chat. We'll talk with Cameron and Chris after both of their talks, so get some questions in, and we'll pass it off to Cameron.
The introduction, and thank you, DJ, for that intro song. That was great. I'm really happy to be here tonight to talk to everybody about the Olympic Cougar Project. Again, my name is Cameron Macias. I'm a graduate student at the University of Idaho. So I'm also a tribal member with the Lower Elwha Klallam Tribe, and that is located in Port Angeles, Washington, which is on the Olympic Peninsula, just west of Seattle and south of Vancouver Island. And I've been working with my tribe's wildlife program since 2014. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about our Cougar Project. So our study area for this project is the Pished Game Management Unit, which extends from Port Angeles to on the east side, all the way to Klallam Bay on the west end, and everything north of Highway 101. And the study area is a little over 600 square kilometers, and it's the core of my tribe's historic use area. So we started this project in 2018 when Kim Sager-Fradkin, the tribe's wildlife program manager, got a grant funded from the Administration for Native Americans. And early on, we wanted to estimate how many cougars live in our city area and how they're moving around the landscape, especially young cats that are dispersing from their mothers and seeking their own territories. So the project started small and has expanded over the years. Right after we got our funding, Dr. Mark Elbrock, who is a Puma specialist with Panthera, and he's also their director of cougar research in North and South America, he moved to the Olympic Peninsula, and shortly afterwards, he joined our project. And he has been instrumental in helping us expand the Olympic Cougar Project. And just to be clear, as Christina already mentioned, cougars are the same thing as pumas, mountain lions, Florida panthers. So they're named differently depending on where you are regionally, but they are the same animal. So they occur only in the Americas, and they extend all the way down to the tip of South America. So Kim Sager, the tribe's wildlife program manager, she was awarded another grant from the Administration for Native Americans earlier this year. And this funding is for the expansion of some of our previous work and is in collaboration with several other tribes on the Olympic Peninsula. And so our project is growing, and that's really important for species like the cougar because they're wide-ranging and they certainly don't stay in one area. So it's also really important for tribes to understand wildlife trends in our historic use areas. Excuse me. The three Klallam tribes and the Skokomish tribe on the peninsula, they signed the Treaty of Point No Point in 1855. So these treaties began our federal recognition, recognition with the U.S. government. And these treaties, in each of these treaties, tribes retained the right to hunt in open and unclaimed lands, as well as regulate the hunting activity of tribal members and manage wildlife resources. Subsistence harvest is a really important part of tribal wildlife programs because tribes for millennia have been hunting deer and elk on the Olympic Peninsula, and it's an important part of tribal culture to be able to hunt wildlife. So the Lower Elwha Klallam Tribe has a co-management responsibility for wildlife in its treaty protected areas, and the tribe sets annual harvest regulations that differ from those set by the state of Washington. But prior to this project, no data had been collected on local predator populations in this area. So we have three main goals for this project. Our first goal is to calculate a population estimate of both cougars and bobcats in the Pished Game Management Unit, the core of the tribe's historic use area. We also have a goal of establishing and maintaining a grid of cameras to document presence of cougars across the landscape, but also a whole slew of other wildlife. And finally, to look at movement, home range, diet, and dispersal across the Olympic Peninsula. So let's talk about the first objective. So cougars are not easy to count. There are many ways to count wildlife, but a lot of those methods are just not possible with rare and elusive species like the cougar. So you have to get creative in how to get population estimates for cougars. So we work with a group called Conservation Canines. We worked with them our first year, and then that group moved off and became the rogue detection teams. And it's the same dogs and same handlers, and these dogs are trained to identify and locate scat of specific species. They're called scat detection dogs. So they can be trained to find all sorts of things, including butterfly larvae, an orca scat from guiding a boat from the bow of the boat. But these dogs, the dogs we worked with, were trained on cougar and bobcat scat. And so what these folks do is they find dogs that are in shelters that are pretty much fetch obsessed and unable to be homed. These are the kind of dogs that are obsessed with playing and won't settle down. And so they find these pups that often need to be rehomed, but they're very trainable given the proper reward. And they train these dogs to become scat detection dogs. And so they show up on site, and one dog and one handler goes out and covers, in our area, it was about a 16 square kilometer region within our study area. And they cover that each day. And every time a dog locates a scat, a cougar or bobcat scat, the correct target scat, the dog sits down and waits for it to be collected by the handler, and then is rewarded with 3 minutes of tennis ball play. So again, these dogs are fetch obsessed, so they live for this reward. And so it's a really cool partnership and just a really cool program. So here's our study area again. We divided it into 32 16 square kilometer grid cells. And so each dog team, would visit one of these cells per day, and they would do their surveys for 32 days, moving across the landscape and collecting bobcat and cougar scat. So we've had 3 years of this study so far. So in the spring of 2018, they collected 207 scats, and then last summer, 162. And then this past summer, they collected 297. And so this is just the 2018 data displayed on this map, but you can get a sense for the distribution of scats. Cougars in the purple squares and bobcats in the red triangles. And then a variety of other species as well. And so you might be wondering, how do scats help us count cougars? Well, once we collect the scats, I bring them back to the University of Idaho and conduct genetic analysis. So when an animal defecates, it sloughs off epithelial cells on the outside, onto the outside of the scat. And so I'm able to collect those cells and extract DNA from them. And from that DNA, I can identify unique individuals. So once I finish identifying each individual animal from the scats, I'll be able to use statistical models to determine population estimates for cats in our study area. So results are still preliminary. I'm working away in the lab, but I'm hoping to have our population estimates sometime next semester. So on to our second objective for our camera grid. Whoops. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure how that happened, so I'm just going to skip ahead. Okay, so our second objective is to establish and maintain a grid of cameras across our study area to document not only cougars, but a whole variety of other species. So we had 64 cameras deployed in 2019. We were able to document tens of thousands of images of wildlife, but we're slowly expanding the scope of our camera grid. And in 2020, this year, we expanded to include two of our neighboring tribes to the east, and we deployed 180 cameras across the landscape. And the new grant that I mentioned before briefly, with that grant, by next summer, we will move even farther to the east and west and deploy 300 cameras across the peninsula. So this is just a map of the grid in the Pisht Game Management Unit, my tribe's study area. And you'll notice that some of the icons look like Sasquatch. And the Sasquatch icons are the cameras adopted by our volunteers. So we have a lot of cameras adopted by volunteer citizen scientists who come out and they help us check our cameras and replace batteries and SD cards. And it's pretty awesome for us. So here we have a selection of photos that were taken from our game cameras. And again, this is covering a full complement of critters. And you might wonder how we get through all these photos. So with our 300 cameras, we're expecting to get 72,000 images of wildlife a year. And so this is a lot of images to go through, and this would take a lot of time for people to go through manually. So we're working with Panthera, and they are developing a classifier called Panthera IDS. And this program is a way of using artificial intelligence or machine learning to classify images. And so ultimately, what we're doing right now is we're training the classifier on animals of the Pacific Northwest. So we sent thousands of images that we've already classified, and we're teaching the program that this is a bear, this is 2 bobcats, this is a coyote, this is a skunk. And so ultimately, when we get our 72,000 photos a year, we don't need to manually look through all of them. We can put them in the system and classify them using that program. And then, so there are also some really cool statistical tools that I won't go into detail with, but they're called time to event and space to event models. And what they allow us to do is estimate densities of animals from their encounter rate with cameras. So we basically estimate how many cougars we have on the landscape or in our study area based on snapshots in time. We use snapshots in time so we're not catching animals moving in or out of a photo, in or out of a camera. So this is exciting for us, and it allows us to monitor the stability of our populations using a non-invasive method, cameras. It also allows us to manage our populations accordingly based on the results of those analyses. So it's really important for tribes because we manage our own hunting regulations, and we want to make sure that each hunting regulation is appropriate for what's going on with our populations. So finally, our last objective, and a big part of this project, is tracking cougars. So we know that over time, the Olympic Peninsula will grow as people continue to move there. Will likely become a climate refuge as other areas of the country become warmer as well. So we want to understand the resources that are important for wildlife. So with cougars, we're looking at their diet, their home ranges, and especially subadult dispersal patterns. And the reason this matters is because the Olympic Peninsula is essentially an island When you consider the city of Olympia, down at the bottom of the Puget Sound, and the I-5 corridor in yellow here, and then the Columbia River to the south, it's pretty hard for wildlife to get on and off the peninsula. Animals either have to cross I-5 or swim across the Columbia River, which is not easy for animals to do. So we really want to know, especially with wide-ranging carnivores like cougars, we're wondering whether we're seeing any connectivity between the Cascades and the Olympic Peninsula, because if not, we might need to be getting concerned about genetics. We know we have the lowest genetic diversity in North America, except for the Florida panther. The cougars on the Olympic Peninsula have low genetic diversity, presumably because they're not leaving the peninsula very often, and that matters. We need to understand that in order to understand connectivity between habitats for all wildlife between the Cascades and the Olympic Peninsula. So to track their movements, we deployed GPS radio collars on cougars that we're able to catch. And these GPS collars get a location on cougars every 2 hours. And then at least once a day, as long as the collars have access to satellites. The collar transmit the stored GPS data to the satellites, and the satellite system we use is the Iridium system. And then that satellite system uploads to a website, and we're able to see where the cougars have been every day. So far, we have radio collared 14 cougars. The green dots here are the locations of a dominant male. It's actually the first male that we collared on the project. And the yellow, blue, and red dots are the home ranges or just locations of females that have much smaller ranges, as you can see, compared to the green dots. So we're able to use these location data to figure out what cougars are eating. So diet isn't the primary thing we're looking at, but we do use the data we collect to hike into these groups of locations, like this one here, that we call clusters. So we look at the proximity of points, and when we have a cat who has spent 4 or more hours within a 250-meter radius, we have a team of people who work in the field, who hike into the cluster and see what the cat did there. So they go in and they try to determine whether the cat was just hanging out or whether it was hunting, and determine whether it was a bed site or a kill site. So when we go into one of our kill sites and we find a kill that actually has meat on it still, which usually means something will come back to it, whether it be a cougar or a scavenger, and like this here, which is a pretty big elk, we deploy a video camera, and we record some pretty neat information. And so I have a couple videos I'd like to share. The next one that Christina will play in a second is from one of our kill sites. And then I have a couple videos that are fun insights into the lives of cougars. So Christina, could you please play that first video? So the next video is of one of our other cats. And this is the kitten of a cougar that we have collared named Charlotte. And this kitten we call Lilu, which is the Klallam word for salmonberry. And this kitten actually grew up, Christina, you can play that one too. This Christina, you can play the third video, but I'm not sure if, I think I'm actually muted when the videos are playing. I have been narrating, but I'm not sure that you can hear me when the video is playing. So maybe after you play the next video, I will describe what's going on. Awesome, thank you. So that was also Charlotte. So the previous video where we saw the siblings, one of them fell off of a log and landed on top of the other. That, I'm not sure if you guys could hear me when that video was playing, so I will say what I said again, which is that one of those kittens survived and is now collared, and we now call that kitten, or we now call that cougar Lilu, which is the Klallam word for salmonberry. The other, unfortunately, was hit by a car, so only one of those two survived. But that was last October, I believe, and now this last video we just saw was from this past October, so just last month. And this is Charlotte, the same mother. She had 2 new kittens. We found her den, and this was her walking in to see her 3 kittens. So pretty exciting. And we also get a lot of other animals on these cameras, and that cougars are sharing their food with, sometimes scavengers. So it's pretty fun to go through these videos. And so that's the Olympic Cougar Project in a nutshell. I just transitioned from a master's to a PhD program at the University of Idaho this semester. So I'm still developing my chapters, but this is a really fun project to work on, and I'm really grateful to be a part of it and to be working with my tribe. Thank you.
Hi, Cameron. Thanks. That was a great presentation. We have a bunch of questions. We'll try to get through however many we can. So the first one is, why are mountain lions coming into more populated areas?
Yeah, so this may be because it may seem like that's happening, or it may be because we're also moving into more wild areas, and so we're encountering them more often. We tend to see animals, we tend to see the younger cougars who are dispersing and they're seeking their own territories. We tend to see them interact with people, encounter people more often because they're more willing to take that risk trying to find their own territory. But as the human population grows and we continue to explore wild areas and expand and build in wild areas, we are exposing ourselves more and increasing the chance of encountering them. So.
Cool. And then you were mentioning the I-5. Someone asked, are wildlife under or over crossings being considered for the I-5 in that area?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's I don't know if you're asking if it's one or the other, or if either of those is being considered.
I think either.
Okay, yeah, that is happening. So Kim and Mark, who work, Kim with the Lower Elwha Tribe and Mark with Panthera, they're working with WashDOT, the Washington Department of Transportation, and a group from the University of Washington, who they're modeling team, and they are building these models called resistance surfaces. So they're looking at the landscape, and they are basically describing certain areas based on their resistance. So areas that are harder for wildlife to move about, so say through a city, a cougar could possibly like travel around the outskirts, but areas like big agricultural lands, those may be harder for animals to move across. So they're looking at a variety of different things on the landscape, roads, train tracks, all sorts of things, and measuring or just sort of trying to describe how hard it is for wildlife to move. And so once all these different organizations come together and build these models, provide the data they have, we will be able to know the areas that are best, easiest for wildlife to travel through. And so that is the goal, to find an area that will be best to build an over or underpass for wildlife. So that is the goal. It's in the distant future, maybe not so distant, but there's no funding for it yet, but it's in the works. It's being planned. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a few more questions. I like this one. Can you tell if the cats are related by their scat?
You can. So that is something that I plan to do as well. And so I'm still working on identifying individuals, but once I do, we can tell relatedness based on individual IDs. So that's something I plan to do in the future.
Cool. I have two more questions. How do you catch the cougars to put the tracking device without hurting them? And then also, does the collar bother them at all?
So we work with houndsmen. We have some local houndsmen on the Olympic Peninsula that we work with. They come out and we search for tracks in the snow, or sometimes they just drive around with their hounds, and hounds will catch a scent of a cougar, and they will release their hounds, who will then tree a cougar. So fortunately, we haven't had anything go wrong with using the hounds. No conflicts or any bad encounters. And so they tree the cougar. We then hike in, and then we dart the cougar. We anesthetize the cougar, and then we try to get the cougar to run down from a tree to basically come down on its own. But sometimes they fall asleep in the tree, and when that happens, we climb up. Somebody on our crew climbs up, and we basically harness in the cougar and lower them back down. And so that's how we are able to capture them. And the second question for the collar, I did show a couple photos of our very first collar that we ever deployed, and it is big. So the size of the collar sometimes the collars are big because of the battery size. And so that a couple of the photos I showed were of collars wearing really big collars, and we didn't really like the look of it, although we have seen some videos. We got really lucky one time when we deployed a camera in an area where there wasn't a kill, but we just saw a lot of scrapes on the ground, and we were interested in seeing whether the cougars were moving through there or why, or so we put up a camera sort of randomly, and we saw a cougar hang out right in front of our camera for a couple days. And a couple times we saw the cougar basically like move the battery around so it could lay down. So, I mean, I'm sure they're not the best. I'm sure they're not comfortable, but we haven't documented or observed anything that's showing that the collars are affecting feeding or anything like that. So we haven't had any injuries from collars or anything like that. They may be a bit uncomfortable, but it appears that they get used to them pretty quickly.
Great, good to know. And then last question, a lot of people want to know, this is a question from Keith. If a mountain lion is forced to move to a new area, evacuate, due to a wildfire, do they attempt to return to that burned area later in life?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I haven't actually considered that before, which I know is a big question in California right now. Maybe Chris might have some ideas about that when he logs in next. They're very territorial, but I'm not sure what their behavior is once they have left an area seeking new territory, and it may depend on whether they find a new territory. I'm not sure. It's a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cameron. It was a great presentation, and we loved all the questions. So we are going to move to Chris now, and hopefully he has a little bit more insight on Keith's question. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Lynn and Christina, for organizing this. My name is Chris Wilmers. I'm a professor of wildlife ecology at UC Santa Cruz. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work we've been doing in our long-term mountain lion project in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California. Next slide, please. So I just want to say really quickly, this is really the product of a big group effort. I've got a number of grad students and postdocs and collaborators and field biologists and houndsmen, pilot, illustrator, dozens of undergraduate volunteers who've all sort of helped put this together. Next slide, please. So when we think of large carnivores, we kind of think of these graceful animals living in wilderness areas like this. Next slide, please. But for more and more of these, large carnivores, this is increasingly the context in which they live. Human land use change is bringing these animals in closer and closer proximity to our ever expanding human footprint. And so trying to understand how humans influence everything from the behavior and physiology of these animals, ultimately up through their populations, ecology, and conservation is the goal of myself and my lab group at UC Santa Cruz. And next slide, please. The study that we're working on here in the Santa Cruz Mountains is particularly interested in land use change and how habitat fragmentation and the sort of intrusion of people into mountain lion habitat influences these animals. So this is the edge of the city of Santa Cruz, and what you can see here is the problem these guys have to face. And that is that, cities are one thing, but as the cities sort of expand into the suburbs and exurbs and rural areas, you see this sort of intrusion of human dwellings and buildings and roads into wildland habitat. And that can have all kinds of impacts. Next slide, please. Here is another impact of the habitat fragmentation. This is Highway 17, or busy highway that sort of can cut the habitat in two. Next slide, please. And this has costs to these animals. So for instance, this is 36N, the 36th animal we call it in our study, and he was a male, so we call him M. And you can see there's a big patch of skin missing from his hind quarter. Probably the result, we're pretty sure, of him getting hit on Highway 17, dragged along the road. This guy was lucky to survive. Next slide, please. Here's a similar thing that happened to a deer we caught on one of our cameras. Next slide, please. But not all animals are so lucky. And so this habitat fragmentation ends up being the largest source of mortality for these guys. A number die on roadways. Many others get depredated. That's when animals come into contact with pets or livestock, and the owner retaliates legally by getting a depredation permit and killing the animal. Next slide, please. And then there's also more insidious effects of fragmentation, such as disease. So this is a coyote on the left and a bobcat on the right. Here, about half a mile from my house in Santa Cruz, and these guys are suffering from mange. And these animals are getting mange increasingly because of the widespread use of rat poisons or rodenticides in our environments. And when rodents come into contact with the poisons, they don't die immediately. They're eventually eaten by these larger predators, who then don't die directly often from the poisons, but it weakens their immune system and they become more susceptible to diseases like mange. Next slide, please. So in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we've been studying these guys, and we do that through a lot of reconnaissance work, like Cameron mentioned, using cameras, as well as by tracking and collaring these animals with GPS tags, like Cameron was doing in Washington as well. Next slide, please. And so we can ask a lot of interesting questions about their ecology and conservation. And one question I get a lot is, well, what do pumas eat? And this is actually a video, so if you could hit the arrow on the lower left-hand corner and play it. The easy answer to that is deer. Mountain lions are an ambush predator, so they sneak up on these deer and they kill them with a bite to the neck or a bite to the nose. And next slide, please. And if we look at what they eat, and we can find their kills by going to clusters of GPS locations once the animal is left and look for prey remains, we see that about 76% of what they're killing is deer, with a smattering of other stuff, most notably raccoons at 7%, house cats at 5%, and a little bit of everything else here and there. Next slide, please. But where they really get their calories are from deer. So if you multiply all those animals in the last figure by body weights, you get to 95% of the biomass they're consuming is from deer. Next slide, please. So then we can also ask sort of more interesting questions like, do mountain lions or pumas, do they fear us? And what I'm showing you here on the left-hand slide is my office building at UC Santa Cruz in the circle. And then that arrow is pointing to this little white dot, which is a GPS location of 36M one summer evening. And then that's me in the upper right-hand panel posing with this deer that he killed with the view of my office in the background. And then on the lower right, that's 36M coming back to feed again the next night. And so maybe they don't feed us. And in fact, it looks like he's kind of stalking me, maybe because I put a collar around his neck. Next slide, please. But we can actually test this experimentally. And so this is another video, if you could play that, please.
Because the grand jury rendered a correct verdict in Ferguson. New York is a little bit different, but
there. And next slide,
Sorry,
please.
Chris, you were muted during that video. Can you explain a little bit what was going on?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's not.
So we first heard frogs, and that was a control sound. So what we did is we went to these kills while they were still fresh. We set up a camera hooked up to an MP3 player, hooked up to a speaker. So when the mountain lion comes back to feed, it hears either the frogs or it hears the humans. And then it videotapes what they do, and so we can see how they respond to the treatment and the control. And as you saw with the frogs, they don't do anything. With the people, they flee. And that was pretty much the story. Pretty much every time they hear frogs, no problem. When they hear people, they always flee. Now, you might have recognized Rush Limbaugh speaking there. We tried radio personalities on the left, radio personalities on the right, nonpartisans, and mountain lions were completely nonpartisan in their fear of people. Next slide, please. So what you can see here is on the left-hand panel A, you see the chances of whether they fled or not. You can see with frogs, they almost never flee. With humans, they almost always flee. And then we ask, if they do come back, how long does it take them to come back? They come back quite quickly with frogs, a little bit longer with humans. And then the ecological effect of all this is what you see in panel C, and that's how much time they spent feeding. If they've heard frogs, they feed for over twice as long as if they've heard people. Next slide, please. And so this actually scales up to influence their kill rates. What we see is that female mountain lions that have higher levels of residential development in their home ranges kill up to 75 deer a year, whereas female mountain lions with very little housing density or in sort of more wildland, completely wildland areas are killing about 50 deer per year. So the influence of people on them and lowering the amount of feeding time they get influences their kill rates on deer. Next slide, please. And then we wanted to understand, okay, that's one thing at the kill, but what if people are out there in the forest and they're talking? How do mountain lions react? And so what we did is we took 2 1 square kilometer patches of forest where people aren't allowed, and we set up speakers on a grid spaced out every 200 meters. So 25 speakers spread out over a square kilometer, playing either frogs for a month or people for a month. And we did this at 2 places. And we collared all the mountain lions that used those 2 patches of habitat, and sampled their GPS every 5 minutes so we could see how they move in relationship to this. And we also put cameras in the woods to look at smaller carnivores and how they responded. And we also trapped for rodents to see if the impacts of people would cascade all the way down to rodents. Next slide, please. And this is kind of what we found. So here's our grid with the speakers in it. And in blue, you see sort of what the typical response was of a mountain lion. That's a mountain lion GPS track. And you can see the mountain lion, you know, doesn't really seem to care about the grid. When you hear it, when it's frogs playing, it walks right through. When it's people talking, though, they kind of get to the grid, they bounce off and they go around it. Occasionally they do go through the grid, but if they do, they kind of split the distance between speakers and move much more cautiously. Next slide, please. So here's sort of a summary of those results. What we see is that they're much more likely to avoid the grid when humans are talking. And they're much more likely to move cautiously when humans are there, if they actually go in the grid. And the cautiousness we measure is movement speed. So they just move much more slowly if there's people there. Next slide, advance, yeah, great. So as far as the smaller carnivores, we looked at bobcats, skunks, and possums. Those were sort of the main smaller carnivores in these 2 areas. And what we see again is that they all respond negatively to humans talking. We weren't really sure whether to expect this or the opposite, actually, because if you think about mountain lions, while they mainly prey on deer, they also prey on all these guys. And so we thought, well, maybe these guys will be happy that mountain lions aren't there and they'll pick up their activity. But we also know that the dominant predator of these guys pretty much all over North America are actually people themselves. People kill small carnivores, all carnivores really, at rates 4 to 9 times what other predators kill them. And so perhaps not surprisingly, they all respond negatively to people as well. Click forward, please. And if you look at rodents, well, the rodents actually seem to benefit quite a lot from people. With all these carnivores no longer on the landscape or minimizing their activity on the landscape, all of a sudden the rodents have a heyday. They more than double their home range sizes. They increase their foraging activity. And so the rodents really benefit. Next slide, please. And so if you're imagining what the forest kind of looks like with and without people in it, this is kind of a schematic of what we expect or what we found. Without people in the forest, you've got these carnivores moving around, doing their thing. And then you've got rodents sort of keeping to tight little areas and pretty scared about what they do and where they forage. Click forward, please. If you have people in the forest, even if they're just talking to each other, all of a sudden the carnivores make themselves scarce and the rodents come out and start moving around a lot more and being much bolder in what they do. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does this fear influence where mountain lions move? So this is a satellite aerial image from like Google Earth of the Santa Cruz Mountains, and overlaid on top of that are the GPS locations of a bunch of mountain lions, a snapshot in time. And each color here is a different animal, and each like dot represents like, you know, a movement every 4 hours or so. And you know what I'm trying to convey here is, wow, it just looks like mountain lions go everywhere, doesn't it? Next slide, please. But actually, if you look closer at their movements, this is the west side of Santa Cruz. You almost never see them actually out in the grassland. They're always moving under the cover of trees or thick shrubs. Even if they come into the edge of an urban area, which is actually quite rare, but I show this because they do it, and it's kind of fun to see how they move into the urban areas. They're always sort of hidden. Next slide, please. This is the UC Santa Cruz campus. Next slide, please. And here's an animal who gets lost. It's an animal on the east side of the Santa Cruz Mountains near Los Gatos. And one day it just ups and moves all the way to Highway 85. Next slide, please. Moves through this sort of heavily, urban area, gets to this 25-foot or 20-foot tall concrete retaining 25-foot wall at the edge of the freeway, can't go any further, and spends the day underneath a bush or boat in this person's backyard, and then comes back the next night. No one was ever the wiser. This is the kind of move that young animals do when they're out exploring and looking for a new territory. Next slide, please. And then this is a sort of even more dramatic example of that same phenomenon. What we're seeing here is in the upper right-hand corner, we're seeing my collar arrive from Germany to Santa Cruz, and then we go out into the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we place the collar on a young male who's still with his mom, and he hangs out in that area for a couple months, and then he disperses. And dispersal is when the young male or female leaves their mom and they go out on their own to find a new territory. And males in particular often travel large distances, sort of looking for a vacant home range, or at least a place where they can sort of start their own career and hopefully expand and make a home range for themselves. And so next slide, please. So he goes out on this walkabout. He ends up crossing Highway 280 into the Los Altos Hills. Next slide, please. And then winds up in downtown Mountain View at about 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun comes up. He says to himself, oh shit. And he goes and he hides in back of a bush next to this apartment building that you can see has a pool on the inside. Next slide, please. And he hangs out behind this bush for the day. This is like a street with people walking down the street, riding their bikes, blah, blah, blah. And he hangs out behind this bush until about 6 o'clock at night. Next slide, please. And until about 6 o'clock, he makes a break for it. He gets seen by the police call in helicopters. Finally, they chase him into this covered parking garage. Next slide, please. And this is Silicon Valley, and so the police here are quite sophisticated when it comes to social media, and immediately they start tweeting about it. They say, possible mountain lion sighting, seen with a radio collar around its neck, do not approach, more info as we have it. Next slide, please. And then they say, this happened right at a time when state law had just changed to mandate local police departments and Fish and Game to try to sort of non-lethally remove mountain lions when they got into urban areas. And so they called us, or actually they didn't call us, they didn't email us, they tweeted at us to see if we could help. And luckily, they figured out quickly that tweeting at us wasn't a good way, so they found our number, they called us. Next slide, please. But they're back on social media, and now they develop a hashtag MV Puma. Next slide, please. And then Julia Vasquez writes, sheltered in place, and we have a hashtag, exciting night in the Silicon Valley. Next slide, please. And so this is the scene when we get there. There's news media. There's a big huddle of people. Next slide, please. And this is the context where the mountain lion has very conveniently been trapped in this garage that has zoo-grade steel to keep it from going anywhere. Next slide, please. And Track Dang writes, Mountain View PD cornered MV Puna beneath a car in an apartment complex. That's my complex, and it's probably my car. Next slide, please. And so here is the Puma, and he's cowering beneath this minivan. And wouldn't you know it, but this mountain lion is really, you know, the Silicon Valley prototype of a mountain lion. He pops up with his own Twitter account and starts tweeting, "This game warden guy has a weird looking gun. Why do you think I'm under the car?" But in any case, we were able to, you know, safely get in there, anesthetize him, and get him into the back of a truck. Next slide, please. And we're able to sort of safely escort him back into the woods. We had a 4-car siren escort. It was pretty awesome. And we were able to get him safely back up into the Santa Cruz Mountains and released safely. Next slide, please. Next slide. But once you know it, he's back on Twitter. Someone got this game camera footage of him a couple days later, and he's saying, "Glad to be back out in the open spaces and soft hills. That city concrete is murder on the paws." Next slide. And Sam Wheatley writes, "We should use the MV Puma hashtag to organize a block party. This is the most contact I've ever had with my neighbors." So, you know, exciting night in Silicon Valley, all kinds of great funny buzz about it on Twitter. And, you know, fortunately, we were able to save this guy and bring him back into nature. Next slide, please. But what it really sort of highlights is the need for maintaining and improving connectivity on our landscape, so that instead of ending up in urban areas, these guys can safely cross freeways and safely cross from one mountain range to the next. And what I've highlighted here in purple are the important areas in our region where we need to sort of improve connectivity. And those are across Highway 17, which is the large purple thing on the left-hand side of the screen. And 2 efforts now are underway, one on the south end and one on the north end, to put tunnels under the freeway for safe mountain lion passage. And then the upper right-hand purple place is highlighting the Coyote Valley, where the city of San Jose and the Peninsula Open Space Trust have just acquired a large property there for over $90 million, and are in the process of making that a sort of wildlife-friendly passage, so that wildlife like mountain lions and other species can get across from one mountain range to the next. And then that lower right purple square is the connection point between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Gavilan Range to the south. I'm very pleased to say that the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County has just acquired, or is in the process of acquiring, a big ranch at the southern end of that purple square called the Rocks Ranch, which will make connectivity possible for mountain lions between those 2 areas. Next slide, please. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. We've got lots more information at our website, where we've got copies of the publications we produce. We've got a blog, we've got a Puma tracker where you can see the tracks of these animals for yourself. And thank you for listening to me, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. And I'm still reeling from that like police saga that you told. Well, I wanted to start off with the question. I don't know if you heard it, that we asked Cameron about the wildfires. I can read it again, but lots of people were wondering. So the question was, if a mountain lion is forced to move to a new area or evacuate due to a wildfire, do they ever attempt to return to that burned area later?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't really have the answer to that. I would expect that they would, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Sounds like a good research area if people want to know. So in response to this, somebody asked, what are mountain lions becoming more adaptable to human presence?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've been doing some other work that is just sort of wrapping up, showing that in some ways yes, and in some ways no, actually. So yes, in that like mountain lions have a very strong fear of people. And that strong fear helps them avoid us because we really are a real danger. And so rather than sort of running into our backyards every day and getting shot, you know, they're avoiding us on the landscape. And that to a certain extent allows them to persist in places with lots of people, like, you know, the Bay Area, California. On the other hand, it turns out that they're not as good at that as we would hope. So they really avoid places like, you know, city of Santa Cruz and places that are more high density development. But then you would hope that they would just sort of have a linear relationship with their love of the landscape as you got fewer and fewer humans. But it turns out that they're actually attracted to places with low levels of sort of rural development. And it's in those places that they're the most likely to die, because those are the places where people are most likely to have goats. And it turns out that goats are something that mountain lions really can't resist. And then on the other hand, when they kill someone's goats, landowners often retaliate by getting a depredation permit and killing that mountain lion. And so in our area, that's the largest source of death for mountain lions. Oh, wow. And really sort of illustrates the non-adaptive behavior they have when it comes to humans.
Yeah. And as a follow-up to kind of like all the experiments you talked about with sound, somebody asked, does the scent of humans cause the predators to avoid the area or move more cautiously through the areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people have been, I mean, the short answer is I don't know exactly, but I have a strong suspicion that scent is not a big problem. So, you know, I guess there's two issues. One is that like mountain lions are not nearly, and cats in general, are not nearly as responsive to scent as like canids and bears are. And then the other thing is that people have done a lot of experiments of the same kind of playback experiment that we did, where they use either sound or scent to try to manipulate what an animal does. And when it comes to fear responses, sound turns out to be something that you much more readily see responses by animals to than scent. Scent is a great way of leaving a message that sticks around for a few hours or a few days, but it doesn't imply that you're right there, right then.
Yeah.
Whereas sound, the message dissipates right away, but you know for sure that that animal or that predator or that human is right there, right then when that sound is made. Right. And so it invokes a lot more fear in animals.
Interesting. So, well, first I just wanted to ask, because I was curious, what in the Santa Cruz Mountains, what's the size of the population of mountain lions in the area that you study? Like,
yeah, so we're still in it's hard to count mountain lions, but we're still in the process of sort of working up an estimate. But I would guess, you know, based on the home range sizes and home range overlap and the amount of area we have, that there's probably like 50 or 60 adult mountain lions.
Okay. In
the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Okay. And then you were mentioning these areas where people are going to build tunnels or overpasses. And how do you train a mountain lion to use a tunnel or overpass? Like, how effective are these for mountain lions? How long does it take them to learn how to find them or use them?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, we're citing these places. We'll take Highway 17, for instance. We're citing those crossing structures in places where mountain lions are already either crossing the road or trying to cross the road. And then So you build the tunnel, and then you build directional fencing along the road, so that if they don't go exactly at the tunnel, they hit the fencing, and then they start walking along the fencing, and they hit the tunnel. And then once they've learned where the tunnel is, then they don't need to know again. So there's two types of animals that are going to use that. There's going to be these dispersing animals that might just use it once. But the animals who are going to use it the most are going to be the animals who have a territory that like includes Highway 17. And so they might be crossing all the time. And those are the animals that are most likely to die on Highway 17 as well. And, by having a tunnel, you'll get them to walk back and forth a lot more and be able to breed on both sides. The Coyote Valley is very different, because the Coyote Valley, you don't really currently have animals crossing the valley that we know of. And that's because it's mostly row agriculture, and there isn't the kind of cover that mountain lions need to walk across. And so part of the plan there is to do some revegetation with native plants to create that cover. And so, where we build the cover is where these animals will go.
Yeah. So follow-up is the population of it. I just have a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
But a couple people want to know, is it possible to estimate a max number of mountain lions that a given area of open space can support?
Yeah, I mean, so across the West, people have, estimated mountain lion population densities. And, those range from roughly like 1 mountain lion to 4 to 5 mountain lions per 100 square kilometers, depending on whether you're in the desert or in the sort of most productive landscapes. And so, my guess is that in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we're at about 3 to 4 animals per 100 square kilometers. So, just take your size of your open space area and multiply it by that.
So how many can I fit in my backyard? And then finally, I think this is a general question about the studies, but when you place a GPS collar on a cat, how long does it last? And do you replace the batteries on the collars when they expire? And like, how do you find the cat when it's expired and not sending you information anymore?
Yeah, great question. So, that depends a lot on study objectives. So, the collars have a user-defined sort of sampling scheme. So you can like collect one GPS location a day and make the collar last for a really long time, or you can ask the collar to take a location every 1 minute or 10 seconds or 5 minutes, and it'll burn through the battery much more quickly. In our study, the collars with the programs we use last about a year or two, at which point we either like can remotely drop the collar off, and then we just send the collar a signal and it goes and it just drops off the animal, and we go out and we collect it, or we can catch the animal again using either hounds or box traps, and then swap out the collar for another one. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for spending the evening with us and for sharing your knowledge in the Santa Cruz Puma Project. So
my pleasure.
Yeah. Good night. I'm going to bring back Lynn to close out the night. Hey, Lynn.
Hi. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and special thanks to Cameron and Chris for joining us tonight. Next week, we'll close off the year with our annual holiday bazaar, night school style. We teamed up with SF Bazaar to bring you an evening of science and nature-inspired crafts. We'll also have a little virtual fair to help you shop online and support local artists.
And again, so I don't know if you've all seen the news, but it's not a surprise, but the Academy, actually, we had to reclose the museum again due to local and state mandates. So unfortunately, that means that nightlife is still not coming back, in the immediate future, but we are going to be doing night schools every Thursday in January. We'll be back in 2021. So please subscribe to our channel. Don't miss a thing. And we know that it's a really, really hard time for everybody. But we would really appreciate any donations to the Academy's Resilience Fund. A link is in the YouTube description. But no matter what, like, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next week. Okay, bye.